Hi there, do you remember I Do? I'm going to shine a spotlight on an actor whose movies might be known and he has a distinctive niche and style, but he's either underappreciated or just underknown. A director, writer, I'm going to compare. Director Joe Dante, his most famous project is perhaps Gremlins, and he did Gremlins 2. And Roger Corman was kind of his muse. Like, he loved science fiction and horror as a child. He's 77 years old now. And his movies incorporate science fiction, horror, adventure, and his love for B movies. But he has made some A movies out of them, and they employ satire and irony and in jokes throughout them. I first knew him from the 1987 movie Inner Space. I saw it on DVD when I was about 18, and the name somehow started seeming familiar. And here's actually Joe Dante pictured right there with that sailor's hat. What looks like a sailor's hat next to Martin Short and Meg Ryan. Now, Inner Space starred Dennis Quaid, Meg Ryan, and Martin Short, and it was about a rambunctious test pilot, Tuck Pendleton, who volunteers for this some scientific laboratory, volunteers for an assignment to get miniaturized and injected into a rabbit, but things go awry when a nefarious group terrorizes them, and the scientist tries to escape, but is murdered by a silent villain with a sort of electronic replacement hand that can like shoot electric sparks out. He kills him, but before then he injects him into Jack Putter, a hyper mitochondriac played by Martin Short, and he works at Safeway, and the movie's set in the San Francisco Bay Area, and he thinks he's insane and goes to the doctor and has hallucinations and dreams, and he finds out that this person talking to him really is real and all about what's going on, and throughout the movie he becomes stronger and becomes a hero. And this guy likes to cast the same actors in smaller and supporting roles, most of all as Dick Miller. He was like the quintessential B movie actor. He was in stuff like, he was in something called A Bucket of Blood in 1959, kind of a morbid picture. But if you look at him on Wikipedia, I remember seeing him, it looked like he was wearing a crown. It had a kind of smile like that on his face. And he was in Terminator. And he's just been in every single Joe Dante film. He passed away in 2019 at the age of 90. He played Mary Futterman, the kind of gruff neighbor on Gremlins. And he seems like a quintessential New York type. Kind of plays maybe the here. I was going to say the everyman, but no, he's just there in every Joe Dante movie. Craggy-faced character actor, best known for a variety of roles in low-budget drive-in photo produced during the 50s and 60s. And Robert Picardo has been in a lot of them, starting with The Howling, that was in 1981. You might know him as the Doctor in Star Trek Voyager and Coach Cutler in Wonder Years. And this William Shallert was an old actor. He was in maybe Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and he was I remember he played a teacher at Theodore Cleaver's school. He plays the Doctor in Inner Space. And Wendy Shaw was in Inner Space as a clerk who was kind of sweet on Martin Short's Jack Putter, but she wasn't that nice. And she did the voice of Francine Smith on American Dad, and she was also the neighbor girl's mom in Small Soldiers, who's played by Kirsten Dunst. And there was Kenneth Tobey, who was he played in he was an old-time actor. He played, oh, here it is, you stupid head. The Great Locomotive Chase is one old thing I know him in. That was an early Disney picture about the true story of the Great Locomotive Chase. I'll show you a picture of that guy in his heyday right there, up here. Yeah, up there. The hat. And the mustache. I think he might have been another one of those sci-fi type actors. I know he was in Inner Space, and he was in Gremlins 2, The New Batch, as the guy who was working the projector booth. And in a scene, he was very briefly in Inner Space, where Martin Short's character was talking to Pendleton, and he's like, "Play with it, pal. Don't talk to it." And then there's a really little known, I think, character actor named Archie Hahn. He was in like the British version of Whose Line Is It Anyway? And Police Academy 5, but I remember seeing him in an episode of Three's Company where Jack and Chrissy have to babysit his baby. But he's had bit parts in Joe Dante movies like this. A guy who was apparently working for the rival, in league with the rival company, and shows up at Jack Putter's apartment, and he acts like he's going to repair something. Then he holds him at gunpoint and, "Where are you going?" And Jack overpowered him. He was the TV repairman in Small Soldiers. Yeah, I think Gremlins was the most mainstream of Joe Dante's movies. Come on. Let's see if I can find my Gizmo doll there. I have a Gizmo doll somewhere. This video will look very bad if I keep walking away from the camera. Yeah. Gremlins was a horror comedy, and some people think of it as Steven Spielberg, but it was really Joe Dante that directed it. And that was a pretty creepy movie. And at the time, it kind of was what prompted the new PG-13 rating to come out. You know, the young man, like 18 or 19 years old, was basically the primary breadwinner working in a bank. Just an all-around nice, innocent kid, and his father was kind of a kook, an inventor who brings him home this mysterious pet, and he was pretty responsible about not feeding him after midnight and stuff, but apparently something happened. He fell asleep, and something happened on the clock, and apparently it was after midnight. Everybody thought it was before midnight when they got fed, and a bunch of hellacious, hell-raising creatures spawned from the little Gizmo. And one of the ironies, I think, in Gremlins 2, The New Batch, those movies are full of gremlins, but one of the ironies I can think of is when the mother was physically and frantically killing the gremlins, the "Do You See What I See" was playing, because it was set around Christmas. Now, I was pretty interested in those movies when I was about 6, but really creeped out, kind of scared by the creatures. Most of all, this image right here is from Gremlins 2, The New Batch, and I was pretty scared, actually, when I saw these creatures hanging from the ceiling in a video store. Now, I have Gremlins 2, the new batch, that actually got a higher rating per Leonard Maltin, who's the most trusted film critic, and that came out in 1996 years after the original, and it was set 8 years in the future. And that one seemed to be the most rife with ironies. That was more creepy than the original, and Christopher Lee played one of the scientists, which added to that kind of feel. But what I remember is that when you're watching the movie, it seems like it's having technical difficulties, and it pauses, and it looks like it's like the video's malfunctioning and not working. And then that's because we cut to a movie theater where apparently they're watching Gremlins 2, the new batch, and the Gremlins were terrorizing the customers, the audience, and then Hulk Hogan shows up, and his tough, cool guy in the era is enough to intimidate them, and finally let the audience watch the movie in peace. And then I remember Leonard Maltin was reviewing the movie Gremlins in the movie and gets terrorized by the Gremlins. Oh, and another one is one of those Joe Dante actors I've seen in multiple movies. Is Kathleen Freeman. She's a lady with really red hair, kind of a hoarse voice maybe, and she played the host of the cooking show in the movie, and a woman in the grocery store who Jack Potter had nightmares about, who's like, "I'm in a hurry," and looked like she was going to pull out a gun and shoot him, but it was really just a lighter where she was lighting her cigarette. Yeah, and in that movie, they're in New York City, and they're in a futuristic building owned by a Donald Trump type, but a nice Donald Trump, played by John Glover. And yeah, they start spawning in that big skyscraper and kind of terrorizing the local area, the region around that in Manhattan. And there's some weird things, not really like a clone human. And the guy who was in Terminator, who was playing poker, or who bought coffee where they had a poker game, and he's like, "Hey, I got a full house, must be like a day," and then he gets killed. But and there was a lot of creepy innovative things in that lab, creepy biology. And another irony is, well, it looked like the Murray Futterman guy got killed in the first movie, but he just got really injured, and he's back in the second one, and he squares off with a gremlin, and it flies up to the top of a church and cements itself in there, killing himself. And there was a more gentle gremlin named Brain Gremlin, who had the voice of Tony Randall, who played Felix Unger in the Odd Couple TV show. And another one in the 80s was The Explorers, which had those like boy actors of the 80s like Ethan Hawke and River Phoenix, and it was about these brainiac boys who end up building a spacecraft and actually traveling to outer space, and they finally meet the aliens, and the big irony is that their whole existence is modeled after what they see on television. And one of his first was Piranha in 1978, but his first might have been It Came From Hollywood in 1976. I think that was like a documentary. And he did The Howling in 1981. That was about... Yeah, that might have been an irony in the fact that it was about a kind of a rehab center where the residents turned out to be werewolves. That was one of those movie covers that I thought looked pretty scary when I was about 10 or 11. And you might also remember The Burbs. That was with Tom Hanks, and it was about a paranoid, overworked suburbanite who was convinced that his neighbors are like occultists. And ultimately, he pretty much turns out that he was right. And here is another one. He hasn't done anything in a really long time. The last mainstream thing I know if he did was Looney Tunes Back in Action in 2003, or the last wide release one. But in January of 1993, he did this one with a really impressive artsy poster. Now that was certainly a fascinating movie. It was sort of a love letter to Joe Dante, or from Joe Dante, about the B movie. And John Goodman played a schlockmeister who was really exploiting. He was in Key West, Florida, right at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and preparing his latest scare your pants off a movie. And it kind of makes fun of the B horror movies at the time, but people at the time when I saw previews for it, it seemed to be like people were really eager to see this like shockingly scary movie about a man who gets turned mutated into a giant ant from radiation. And it just, to the audience, it seemed like it was what Jaws must have been like when it originally came out. And it centers on a boy about 15 years old and who was a fan of this, Shockmaster, and his brother when they're at the movies, and they're excited to hear that he's coming into town, and he has a best friend, and they both have girlfriends, and her girlfriend is more moving towards the progressive views of girls, young women at the time. And and his father's away in the service, and everyone's on the edge because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it seemed like he was a warped individual who was like a sadistic. It seemed like he thought it was the perfect time for what they call Ramble-Rama, and he incorporates earthquakes and someone dressed in an ant costume, because apparently back then people could believe that radiation could cause that to happen to a person. And Archie Hahn, who I mentioned, was the person in the movie within the movie near the beginning called Shopping Cart, which is kind of a corny Hitchcockian type movie. And in the movie, like I said, it's about a mutated giant ant, and it also incorporates earthquakes and made people shake, like extreme shaking, and people getting shocked in their seats, and ultimately it caused a real earthquake that put people in danger in the theater, and people would run out screaming, evacuating, thinking we were actually attacked in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah, it was just crazy. See, here's the movie poster. Yeah, it was just a love letter to the B-movie type horror and science fiction movies, and William Shallert was a scientist in the movie. And it had Dick Miller and Robert Picardo. Dick Miller, I think, was someone working in a theater who was a former actor. Yeah, I don't know how I first found out about John Goodman was interesting. I had recently found out about the late John Candy, and it was around Christmas time when I was 13 in 1999, and I was talking with my mom, my brother, and my brother Pat was saying how the heavy set guys, someone was talking about the heavy set guys that passed away, and they also happened to be named John, and my mom was talking about how John Candy had passed away, and how John Belushi was gone, and I thought she said John Goodman, but just a little months later I found out who John Goodman actually was. She's like, no, he didn't pass away that I'm aware of. And I soon found out about him from the Flintstones movie. It was Fred Flintstone. And most famous for playing Dan Connor and Roseanne. Anything I'm missing? Oh yeah, he directed one segment of the Twilight Zone movie in 1983. And he did something called Amazon Woman on the Moon in 1987. I never saw that one, but Another kind of later one he did was the one that was probably the most popular with my age group, and that was Small Soldiers. That was like if you cross Toy Story with the Gremlins. You know how that goes. And one of the in-jokes was in there was one of the creators of the toys. His password was Gizmo, and there was a really harsh boss and two techies played by Jay Moore and David Cross who were desperate to please their harsh, cruel boss played by Dennis Leary. And so one of them created toys that were supposed to be kind and educational. The Gorgonites, these kind of grotesque, quote, aliens. And the other guy was played by Jay Moore. He was impressed by his boss, who said that kids love violence, and they created the ultimate action figure. And they inserted a sip in both of these toys that were sentient and had emotions, and they were programmed to fight and destroy the Gorgonites. And it was a real satire on toys and, realism and technological advancements. The point was that technological advancements can breed real disaster. And the story centered on a toy show centered on a troubled teenage boy named Alan. And he was working in the toy store, and Dick Miller played the truck driver who was also worked with him in the toy store. And somehow a Gorgonite ends up home with him, and there's a neighbor girl who he's sweet on, played by Kirsten Dunst, and his little brother, one of the commando elites, and they came home to the neighbor's house, but they're just bellicose and programmed for war and to attack anyone who they thought was a threat to their mission to destroy the Gorgonites. And this Gregory Smith actor was in Harriet the Spy, and he was actually the son in The Patriot who caused the peaceful single family man who had who was strongly opposed to war to finally step into the fray when he was killed. And I thought that had one of the best soundtracks. It had a lot of 70s classic rock, like another one, Bites the Dust by Queen. That's the first place I heard that. And My City Was Gone by the Pretenders, Tom Sawyer by Rush, and Love is a Battlefield, Communication Breakdown. And at the time I didn't know a lot of classic rock, but in 2007 when we got it on DVD, and I was starting to be into that retro stuff as it was at the time. Yeah, that stuff was retro even back then, but like 1998 wasn't particularly retro then. It seemed relatively modern, but that movie by then seemed like it had the spirit and look of the 80s with the help of that kind of the ambience that was created by the music and the Joe Dante. The 80s was his heyday, and Robert Picardo played the technician who inserted the chip into the toys, and Archie Hahn was the TV repairman, and that was Phil Hartman's last movie as that annoying neighbor he's played before, the father of Kirsten Dunst's character. And like I said, Wendy Shaw from Inner Space played her mom. And that movie also caused some controversy by selling toys at Burger King with its PG-13 rating and its violence. And, I don't really think it earned the PG-13 rating. It wasn't that gory, or it didn't have anything really raunchy or that much profanity in it. And it was kind of like Gremlins in obvious ways, but in this one, the main boy character was a wayward troublemaker, and versus the really sweet, innocent kid that was Billy Peltzer in Gremlins. Now, the last really mainstream thing I saw him in was Looney Tunes Back in Action in 2003. And that was pretty funny, seeing the banter between Brendan Fraser and Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny. And there's also a big irony at the end of that movie. which I'm not gonna give a spoiler. And in Small Soldiers, the leader of the Commando Elites, Chip Hazard, was played by Tommy Lee Jones, and the soldiers were played by cast members of the Dirty Dozen like Clint Walker and Bruce Dern. Bruce Dern was actually in The Burbs as one of the nefarious neighbors. And the imposing voice of Frank Langella was Archer, and the toys were played by cast members of Christopher Guest movies, including Christopher Guest, Harry Shearer, Michael McKean, and others. And there was a movie called The Hole in 2009, which I didn't see, and he was in something called Burying the Axe in 2014. Those are the last two Joe Dante movies I know of. And in 1993, he apparently did a TV show called Erie, Indiana. I wonder if I'm missing anything here. Nightmare Cinema in 2018. Yeah, you should look him up. I think he's an underappreciated filmmaker. You know who he is. Like and subscribe and tell me what you think. Gosh, I hope I'm not missing anything here. Gremlins 2, the new batch. Okay, nice talking to you. Hope I didn't make any stupid mistakes this time.